feeling a bit self-conscious about my producer deck, so I apologize. It's not going to be quite as attractive as everybody else's. So I'm here to talk about Assemble with Care, which is a project that we released in September this year. So I was the producer on it and eventually kind of stepped into a writing role to kind of bring the narrative and the gameplay back together. So if people aren't familiar with us, we're Ustwo Games, so we're a smaller part of a bigger company called Ustwo, which does digital product design. So we're a studio of about 25 people based in South London, and we mainly focus on making premium mobile games that are focused on sort of elegant design, artistry, and trying to bring meaningful experiences to a mobile audience. As was already said, our most famous games are Monument Valley and Monument Valley 2. So before I talk about Assemble with Care, I wanted to just explain a few of the values that our games try and kind of possess. So one is that we try and have a lot of personality in our games. We want them to feel really handcrafted. One is that we really focus on making our games as approachable as possible. We try to respect people's time and really prioritize user testing to make things for players, not just for ourselves. And finally, we try to make things that have a really clear and simple message that's kind of hidden beneath the gameplay that we put in. I don't know how many people in here will have played the game, so just to give you a quick kind of introduction to it. It's a game about a traveling repairwoman who goes to a small town and ends up meeting these two families and tries to kind of help those families come back together where their relationships have kind of fractured. So she's helping them to sort of fix these objects that they want fixed, but she also kind of helps to put them back together. So I'm just going to show a quick trailer, and then I'll talk a bit about the process we went through making the game.
You ever wonder why we get so attached to things? When you think about it, all this stuff we own is just screws and wires. Except sometimes it isn't. A whole life can be captured in the flash of a camera. Wounds healed by picking up a phone. Even the smallest object can hold the biggest meaning. But when it all falls apart, how do we put things together again?
So the first stage with this, which I'm sure in many industries would be the same, was the sort of prototyping phase. So at this stage, we're kind of trying out ideas for the first time. So we're really looking to make kind of quick and dirty kind of gameplay demos and really test our assumptions about why we think a particular idea is exciting. So the first prototype that we made with this particular project was the one on the left here, which you might not be able to tell. This is a cassette deck made by very capable programmers and designers who are working very quickly. So we just tested this out really quickly, really liked the idea of kind of fixing this physical object. At the same time, we were trying to explore some of the art styles that might eventually tie in. So we were looking at nolling, and what we kind of referred to as like the art of fixing, something that we felt was coming up quite a lot on Instagram and that kind of creator side. And then finally, we also liked the idea generally that these objects would have some kind of emotional resonance. So they could be something that allows you to hear a recording that you thought was lost, or that show you slides that maybe you had preserved a moment fixed in time that you'd kind of forgotten about. So we had these three things, and we kind of brought them together into a sort of coherent prototype, and then we figured out what the design challenges were going to be for this idea. That obviously this is an 18-month project. There were many, many challenges, but I'm just going to talk about three of them. So one was this idea of how do we make something digital feel physical. One was how do we use objects to tell a story about people. And finally, how could we make this accessible to what was a mobile casual audience, which is our usual primary audience. So the first challenge was this sense of physicality, and I think in the studio and generally kind of maybe with our generation, there's a lot of nostalgia for these physical, tactile objects that maybe we've kind of neglected in the last sort of 15 years or so, things like vinyl, things like film photography. These were objects that maybe we had at home that we just liked having around, and eventually we even started buying and bringing into the studio for reference. So when we had these objects around, the question was, how do we turn these into something that feels physical when it's going to be seen on a phone screen? So something that was really important to us was to preserve this idea of being able to manipulate the object in 3D to feel like you were able to pick it up and look at any part of it that you wanted to. As you were doing that, we tried to make sure that the experience of fixing these objects, it was how you imagine it is. If you decide to try and fix your own cassette deck, it won't probably be exactly like this. And some of these objects got very complex, but we tried to keep them more to your kind of best case version of how that would work. And then finally, we tried to lean into kind of the benefits of the specific devices that we work on. Working in mobile games, we use something called haptic feedback, which is something that's possible in some iPhones and possibly some Android phones. Sorry, this is an Apple one. I'm sorry for any Android people here today. So there's a sensation that you can get kind of click out of the phone, so we tried to tie that into the feeling as you were taking apart and putting back together these objects as well. So once we'd gone the design side, then we thought, okay, how are we going to make this look visually? So we liked the idea of having a kind of painterly visual style, something where you could see the brushstrokes, almost imagine that someone had painted it themselves. So initially we do what was called paint overs, so we'll take an object from the scene and we'll literally just paint on the top of it to try and get a sense of the mood. Then we'll work that up into more high-fidelity concepts that kind of has a lot more of the tone and the feeling that we're trying to get to. And then we have to sort of deal with reality a bit, and we have to figure out how do we take that like best version of it and turn it into something that's also going to be able to be readable for players, to be able to perform well on device. So you can see on the right there's a relatively close to final example of how that art style eventually got communicated into the game. So the next thing to kind of talk about really is how do we tell a story through objects. And when we first came up with the idea, something that we were really drawn to was the idea of this person, whoever they were fixing the objects, was serving as a kind of confessional listener, almost in the way that a taxi driver might or a hairdresser might. You end up revealing your secrets to them even though you barely know them. So we had this idea of customers coming in and out, and maybe they would be telling their stories about themselves, how they know each other, and the town itself, which might be undergoing some kind of significant change. Unfortunately, obviously, when you try to user test these things, you realize how you're going to have to adapt. And there was too much information going on outside the core of the gameplay, which was the objects themselves and then the characters that were in front of people. So we really focused on stripping that back to try and make it more about the people that were in this game and the objects that they were bringing. And we lent into what felt like the strongest metaphor that we had available, which was obviously this idea of fixing things and putting things together that had perhaps been broken. And that all sounds kind of, maybe okay, but the hard thing was that we were trying to do that alongside also making the game itself. And because of the bespoke nature of all the levels in this game, we had to do a lot of readjustment depending on how difficult each particular level might turn out to be. Some things we just had to cut entirely because they didn't really pan out into something that felt fun. And every time we did that, we had to rewrite the story. So it was quite hard. So we had to switch around. Some objects would belong to one character. They'd have to belong to another one now. So we had to do a lot of redrafting. But every time we did that, we kind of simplified the narrative and felt like we kind of had a lot more cohesion with the objects themselves. So ultimately, that was a really good process. And then in terms of telling the story, I know this is a lot of information. I apologize. This is, I hope this isn't overloading people. So in terms of actually telling the story, initially we had that idea about it being a bit more of a dialogue, a bit more of a back and forth between the customer and the person fixing things. But again, with user testing being really important, we tried to test this in our worst case scenario, which was that someone didn't have the sound on, because we were trying to use voiceover to really emphasize this story. And without the sound, it just didn't make any sense to anybody. So instead, we tried to bring in the idea of having a narrator, so the player's character gives a bit more commentary on what's going on. And then from that, we kind of polish that up into the final visuals that kind of make up the story parts of the game. So we tried to make that feel kind of calm, meditative, and it feels like someone is telling you a story. This is like a safe kind of space to just enjoy a relaxing narrative and feel like you've kind of fixed some things. So we kind of liked that it kind of went in that direction ultimately. And the third challenge that I was just going to speak about was this idea of trying to make something for a mobile audience and yet still make it have like kind of maybe a long-term meaning or something that it leaves them with long after they've finished playing. So there's some assumptions that are typically made about mobile games audiences. Maybe that they only have a casual interest in gaming, that they're likely to have short and quite distractible play sessions, perhaps on the tube or on the bus, on their commute, and that they might be very unfamiliar with any complex forms of input. So typically games might be played with a controller, you're using you know, joysticks and all this kind of thing. I sound like I don't know how games work now, this is great. I do know how to play games. I'm just role-playing. Yeah, we try to design around interactions that are going to be very familiar for people who have smartphones, but not necessarily people who have games experience outside of phones. So taps and swipes, drags, anything that you would typically do on a phone. And then once we do that, we then really user test every aspect of the game. I very carefully chose a bit where it doesn't look like it's going awfully in our user testing sessions, but most of it's pretty painful to watch back now, actually. But we'll test things like the mechanics, we'll test the puzzles. As I said before, we'll test even the order that the levels are given to people in, and we'll respond to that. And we did test this narrative, and we made quite considerable kind of cuts and adjustments there as well. So just an example of how one element of the game evolved through this testing. So this is a very early prototype of the projector level that's in the game. And you can kind of see in the bottom left, you might not be able to see super well, there's like a tiny drawing of a screwdriver. So this was one of the early kind of prototypes we made for the way that people would interact with the tools in the game. And when we did this, it kind of worked, but it didn't really capture the sense of physicality, which was something that we thought was really, really important. People didn't really comment on that aspect. So we instead switched to what's called diegetic kind of UI. So it's stuff that is in the world and in the scene with people. So now the screwdriver on the shelf performs the same function as that one in the corner. And then once we'd done that, and once we'd kind of gotten that to something that we were happy with, we kind of pushed it a bit further, and we thought, well, what we're doing is relying on people using their real-world knowledge to know that that's a screwdriver that they can attach to a screw. So we were just a bit playful with it, and we tried to have the coffee cup in the corner of the screen be the pause menu, because we just thought that's quite a nice kind of surprise. Like, oh, I'll have a little coffee break, and people can trust their instincts a bit, and they get a nice payoff out of that. Yeah, so I guess the result, so I don't want to spoil the game too much because I hope you all go off and play it. But really when we were kind of bringing this all together, what we were trying to do was kind of make a game with feeling, both in the physical sense and also in the emotional sense. Something that would maybe tap into that kind of feeling that I think we all have about just wanting to kind of take something back from our childhood or something that we remember from a few years ago and actually treasure that thing and treasure that moment for a little while at least. And finally, something that hopefully would be a comfortable experience for anyone who picks it up, regardless of how experienced they were with playing games, something that you can play and enjoy, and then you can pass it to your nan, and she might be able to play and enjoy it too. Yeah, that's kind of me. So yeah, thank you. We have, I put our Twitter things on it. The very sensible one is the work one, and the really bad one underneath is mine. So yeah, still regretting that decision. But yeah, thank you very much.